I was sitting in my own living room, surrounded by my three children, and they were speaking to me like I was a confused teenager who had gotten involved with the wrong crowd. My daughter Karen had printed out articles about senior romance scams. My son Michael had brought a background check he had run on Richard without my knowledge or permission. My youngest, Amy, was crying, saying she couldn't believe I was doing this to their father's memory. They called it an intervention. They said they were worried about me. They claimed they were protecting me from making a terrible mistake. What they were really doing was trying to control me, to keep me frozen in widowhood forever, to deny me the right to feel joy and companionship and love again. All because I was 68 years old and apparently too old to deserve happiness. My name is Helen, and I was married to Paul for 44 years. He was my high school sweetheart, my best friend, my partner in everything. We built a beautiful life together, raised three children, celebrated countless holidays, supported each other through every challenge and triumph. When he died of cancer 3 years ago, I thought my life was over. The grief was suffocating. I couldn't imagine ever feeling whole again. For 2 years, I barely functioned. I went through the motions, saw my children and grandchildren, maintained my house, attended church, but I felt like a ghost. Part of me had died with Paul, and I didn't know if that part would ever come back. My children were supportive at first. They called regularly, invited me for dinner, made sure I wasn't isolated. But as time went on, they seemed to settle into the idea that this was my permanent state. I was Mom the widow, the grandmother who babysat and brought cookies and existed primarily to support their lives. They never asked if I was lonely. They never suggested I might want to rebuild my own life. They seemed to assume I was content. I wasn't content. I was surviving, but I wasn't living. Then, 2.5 years after Paul died, I met Richard. It happened at a community gardening club I had joined. My neighbour had convinced me to come, saying it would be good for me to get out of the house and do something I enjoyed. I had always loved gardening. Paul and I had spent countless hours working in our yard together, so I agreed. Richard was there that first day, working on the tomato beds. He was 71, a widower himself, with kind eyes and gentle hands that handled the plants with obvious care. We started talking about soil composition and heirloom varieties, and before I knew it, an hour had passed. It was the first time since Paul's death that I had lost track of time while doing something other than grieving. We both kept coming back to the gardening club. We would work side by side, talking about plants, but also about life. He told me about his wife Margaret, who had died 4 years earlier from a stroke. He told me about his children and grandchildren, about his career as a high school history teacher, about his love of old movies and classical music. I told him about Paul, about my children, about the life I had built and lost. There was no pressure, no expectation. Just two people who understood loss, talking to someone who understood. After 2 months of these weekly meetings, Richard asked if I would like to have coffee with him sometime outside of the gardening club. My heart jumped. It felt like being asked out for the first time as a teenager. I said yes. That first coffee date turned into regular Sunday brunches. The brunches turned into movie matinees and evening walks. Slowly, carefully, we were building something. Not a replacement for what we had lost. You can't replace 44 years of marriage. But something new, something that honored our past loves while allowing for present companionship. Richard made me laugh. He listened when I talked. He shared my values, my interests, my stage of life. He understood that intimacy at our age looked different, but was no less meaningful. He never tried to be Paul, never tried to erase my history. He simply offered me friendship, companionship, and the possibility of not being alone. After 6 months of dating, I realized I was happy. Genuinely, unexpectedly happy. And I wanted to share that with my children. I invited all three of them for dinner and told them about Richard. I explained that I had been seeing someone, that he was a wonderful man, and that he made me very happy. I thought they would be pleased for me. I thought they would understand that finding companionship after loss was a beautiful thing. I was completely wrong. Karen's face went pale. She asked how long this had been going on, why I hadn't told them sooner, what I really knew about this man. Michael immediately asked if Richard knew I owned my house and had savings. Amy started crying and asked how I could do this to Dad. I tried to explain. I told them about meeting Richard at the gardening club, about our shared love of plants and old movies, about how he understood loss because he had experienced it himself. I told them that Paul would have wanted me to be happy, that he had specifically told me before he died not to spend the rest of my life alone. But they weren't listening. They had already decided this was a disaster. Over the next few weeks, each of them took turns calling me to express their concerns. Karen researched romance scams and sent me article after article about elderly women being exploited by predatory men. Michael ran a background check on Richard without telling me, and then called to say that Richard had some credit card debt from a few years ago, which proved he was after my money. Amy kept saying it was too soon, that I was dishonoring their father, that people would talk. I tried to be patient. I understood that seeing their mother with someone other than their father was difficult. I gave them time to adjust. But instead of adjusting, they escalated. Michael called Richard directly and told him to stay away from me. Karen showed up at my house unannounced to lecture me about protecting my assets. Amy sent me guilt-laden messages about how hurt she was, how she couldn't believe I was replacing Dad, how this was breaking her heart. Richard handled it all with remarkable grace. He told me he understood their protectiveness, that he would give them space to come around. He said what mattered was that we made each other happy, and eventually my children would see that. But I was hurt and angry. I was a grown woman, not a child who needed their permission to date. I had been a good mother, a devoted wife, a responsible adult my entire life. I deserved to make my own choices about my personal happiness. I told my children that I understood their concerns, but that I was going to continue seeing Richard. I told them I hoped they would eventually accept this, but that my decision was final. That's when they staged the intervention. They showed up together, unannounced, and told me we needed to have a serious talk. They had coordinated their arguments. They had brought evidence. They were presenting a united front. Karen went first with her printed articles about romance scams. She highlighted statistics about how many seniors lose money to predatory partners. She pointed out that Richard and I had only known each other for 6 months, which wasn't long enough to truly know someone. She suggested that his interest in me was suspicious, given that I owned my home and had retirement savings. Michael presented his background check. He pointed out Richard's credit card debt as evidence of financial instability. He mentioned that Richard had been married twice before Margaret, something Richard had told me about himself, but which Michael presented as if it were a dark secret. He suggested that Richard was clearly a man who used women for financial support. Amy took the emotional approach. She said she felt like she was losing me. She said I was abandoning the family Dad had built. She said my grandchildren were confused about why Grandma had a new friend who was a man. She said she didn't know how to explain this to people at church. I sat through all of it, my anger building with each accusation, each assumption, each attempt to manipulate me through fear or guilt. When they finished, they looked at me expectantly. as if I would immediately agree that they were right and promise to stop seeing Richard. Instead, I told them to leave. I told them that I loved them, but they had crossed a line. I said I had listened to their concerns, but that I was a competent adult, capable of making my own decisions. I said Richard had been nothing but kind, respectful, and honest with me. I said the credit card debt Michael had discovered was from medical bills after Margaret's stroke, which Richard had already explained to me. I said his two previous marriages had been in his 20s and 30s, decades before he met Margaret, and that judging someone's character based on failed relationships from 50 years ago was absurd. I told them that their father had explicitly told me to find happiness again, that he had made me promise not to spend my life alone. I said I was honoring his memory by living fully, not by becoming a grief-stricken recluse who existed only to serve their needs. And I told them that if they couldn't respect my choices and treat Richard with basic courtesy, then they needed to examine whether their concern was really about protecting me or about controlling me. They were shocked. I had never spoken to them that way before. I had always been accommodating, always put their feelings first, always been the selfless mother who prioritized family harmony above everything. But I was done with that. I was done shrinking my life to make them comfortable. Karen said I was making a huge mistake. Michael said I would regret this. Amy said she needed time away from me because this was too painful. They left, and I didn't hear from any of them for 3 months. Those 3 months were difficult. I missed my children and grandchildren terribly, but I also felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in years, I was living for myself, making choices based on what I wanted rather than what others expected. Richard and I continued to grow closer. We talked about the situation with my children, and he offered several times to step back if it would help repair my relationship with them. But I refused. I told him that my children's inability to accept my happiness was their problem to work through, not ours. After 3 months, Amy called. She said she had been thinking about what I said, and she realized she had been selfish. She said she had been so focused on her own grief and discomfort that she hadn't considered my loneliness. She asked if she could meet Richard. I invited them both to dinner. Amy was nervous, but she tried. She asked Richard polite questions about his life, his interests, his intentions. Richard was warm and patient, never defensive, always genuine. By the end of the evening, I could see Amy softening. She called me the next day and apologized. She said Richard seemed like a good man, and that if he made me happy, she wanted to support that. She said she couldn't promise her siblings would come around quickly, but that she was done fighting me on this. It took Karen and Michael longer. Karen eventually called to say she still had concerns, but that she trusted my judgment. Michael remained distant for over a year before finally agreeing to meet Richard. The meeting was stiff and awkward, but it was a start. My children's acceptance has been gradual and imperfect. There are still moments of tension, still comments that reveal their discomfort. But they're trying, and that's what matters. Richard and I have been together for 3 years now. We don't live together. We both value our independence and our separate homes, but we see each other several times a week. We travel together, garden together, share meals and movies and long conversations. We hold hands, we laugh. We support each other through the challenges of aging. We're not trying to recreate our first marriages. We're building something appropriate for this stage of life. Companionship, affection, shared interests, mutual respect. It's not the passionate romance of youth, but it's no less valuable. I'm 71 now, and I'm happier than I've been in years. Not because Richard has completed me or saved me or any other romantic notion, but because I've reclaimed my right to make choices about my own life, to pursue my own happiness, to refuse to be defined solely as a widow or a mother or a grandmother. Society has deeply ingrained ideas about what's appropriate for elderly women. We're supposed to be selfless, sexless, content with our memories. We're expected to devote our later years entirely to supporting our children and grandchildren. The idea that we might want romance, companionship, physical affection, that makes people deeply uncomfortable. But we're still human. We still need connection. Loneliness doesn't become acceptable just because you've reached a certain age. The desire for companionship doesn't expire when your spouse dies. My children's initial reaction came from fear, fear of change, fear of a stranger entering the family, fear of me being hurt. But underneath that was something else, the belief that my romantic life ended when their father died, that I had served my purpose as a wife and should be content in my supporting role as mother and grandmother. They had to learn that I was still a whole person with needs and desires beyond serving them. That lesson was uncomfortable for all of us, but it was necessary. If you're a senior who has lost a spouse and is considering dating again, know that you have every right to pursue companionship. You don't need your children's permission. You don't need to justify your choices or defend your happiness. You've earned the right to live fully at every stage of life. Be smart, yes. Don't rush into anything. Protect your finances. Listen to legitimate concerns about safety. But don't let fear, yours or others, keep you from experiencing joy. And if you're an adult child worried about a parent who is dating after loss, examine your motivations carefully. Are you genuinely concerned about their safety? Or are you uncomfortable with them moving on? Are you protecting them or controlling them? Are you treating them as a competent adult or as a child who needs your management? Your parents raised you, supported you, helped you build your life. They deserve the same respect and autonomy you expect for yourself. I'm grateful for Richard, but I'm equally grateful for what standing up to my children taught me, that I still have agency, that my life is still mine to live, that happiness doesn't have an expiration date. Paul would have been happy for me. I'm certain of that. He loved me enough to want me to be loved again. My children are learning to be happy for me too. It's taken time, but we're getting there. And Richard? He's in the living room right now, making us tea while I write this. In a few minutes, we're going to sit on the back porch and watch the sunset. Maybe we'll work in the garden a bit before it gets dark. It's a simple, quiet life, but it's a happy one, and I refuse to apologize for that.